In this video lesson, we'll investigate the attempts of the new government and Alexander Hamilton to create a national bank and a public and government credit system. The national debt had swelled to $75 million, owing to Alexander Hamilton's insistence on honoring the outstanding federal and state obligations. And Hamilton was titled the father of the national debt, but he was not worried because his objectives were very political and economic. He believed that within limits, a national debt was a national blessing, a kind of union adhesive, and the more creditors to whom the government owed money, the more people would have a personal stake in the success of the government. His unique contribution was to make debt an asset for vitalizing the financial system. Where was the money to come from to pay interest on this huge debt to run the government? The money was to come from customs duties, derived from a tariff. Tariff revenues depended on a vigorous foreign trade, another crucial link in Hamilton's overall economic strategy for the new government. The first tariff law, imposing a low tariff of about 8% on the value of dutiable imports, was speedily passed by the first Congress before Hamilton was in place. Revenue was by far the main goal, but the measure was also designed to erect a low protective wall around infant industries, which needed shelter from foreign products. Hamilton argued strongly in favor for more protection from the well-to-do new manufacturing groups, another vital element in Hamilton's economic program. But Congress was still dominated by agricultural and commercial interests, and it voted only 2 slight increases in the tariff during Washington's presidency. Hamilton sought additional internal revenue and in 1791 secured from Congress an excise tax on a few domestic items, the most notable whiskey, and the new levy of 7 cents a gallon was borne chiefly by the distillers who lived in the back country. Whiskey flowed so freely on the frontier in the form of distilled liquor that it was actually used and traded for money. As a capstone for his financial system, Hamilton proposed a Bank of the United States. An enthusiastic admirer of the English, he took the model from them and from the Bank of England. He proposed a powerful private institution of which the government would be the major stockholder and the federal treasury would deposit its surplus monies. The central government not only would have a convenient strongbox, but federal funds would stimulate business by remaining in circulation. The bank would also print urgently needed paper money and provide a sound and stable national currency. But was it constitutional? Jefferson, whose opinion Washington requested, argued against the national bank. He insisted that no specific authorization in the Constitution was available to create such a financial octopus, as he called it. He was convinced that all the powers not granted to the central government were reserved to the states, as provided in the about-to-be ratified Bill of Rights and in the 10th Amendment. Jefferson concluded that the states, not Congress, had the power to charter banks, and he believed that the Constitution should be interpreted literally or strictly. Hamilton prepared a brilliant reasoned reply to Jefferson's arguments, and he believed that the Constitution, what it did not forbid, it permitted. Jefferson, on the other side, generally believed that what it did not permit, it forbade. Hamilton boldly invoked that the Constitution stipulates that Congress may pass any laws necessary and proper to carry out the powers vested in the various agencies. By virtue of implied powers, Hamilton contended for a loose or broad interpretation of the Constitution. He and Federalist followers evolved the theory of loose construction by invoking the elastic clause of the Constitution. Hamilton's eloquent and realistic arguments were accepted by Washington, who reluctantly signed the bank measure into law. But the most enthusiastic support for the bank naturally came from the commercial and financial centers of the North, whereas the strongest opposition came from the agricultural South. The Bank of the United States, as it was created by Congress in 1791, was chartered for 20 years, located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on 3rd Street, and you can still see it today. 1/5 of it was owned by the federal government, and the stock was thrown open for public sale. The Whiskey Rebellion, which flared up in southwestern Pennsylvania in 1794, sharply challenged the new national government, as well as Hamilton's excise tax, because it was harsh on the pioneers. The pioneer folk regarded it not as a tax, but as a frivolous luxury, or not as a frivolous luxury, but as a burden on economic necessity and a medium of exchange. Rye and corn crops distilled into alcohol were more cheaply transported to eastern markets than bales of grain. Defiant distillers finally erected whiskey poles and raised the cry of liberty and no excise, boldly tarring and feathering revenue officers, bringing collections to a halt, much like during the time before the American Revolution. President Washington was alarmed by what he called these self-created societies, and encouraged by Hamilton, he summoned the militia of several states, an army of about 13,000. And when the troops reached the hills of western Pennsylvania, led by Washington, they found no insurrection as the Whiskey Boys were basically captured. Washington, with an eye to healing old sores, pardoned the convicted culprits, but declared that the tax was the law of the land. The Whiskey Rebellion was very small, but its consequences were very important. George Washington showed that his new government, now substantially strengthened under the Constitution, commanded a new respect and could enforce its own laws. Almost overnight, Hamilton's fiscal feats had established the government's sound credit rating. The Treasury could now borrow needed funds in Netherlands and favorable terms. But Hamilton's financial successes, funding, assumption, the excise tax, the bank, and the suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion created some political liabilities. All of these schemes encroached sharply upon states' rights and granted more power to the federal government. So now, out of resentment against Hamilton's revenue-raising and centralizing policies, an organized opposition began to build, and what was once a personal feud between Hamilton and Jefferson developed into a full-blown political rivalry. National political parties, in the modern sense, had been unknown in America when George Washington took office, but now these groups were starting to develop in the United States. The founders at Philadelphia had not foreseen the existence of permanent political parties. Organized opposition to the government seemed tainted with disloyalty, and the notion of a political party apparatus was a novelty in the 1790s. And when Jefferson and Madison first organized their opposition to Hamilton's program, they confined their activities to Congress and did not anticipate creating a long-lived popular party. As the widely read newspapers of the day spread the political message of Hamilton's political ideas, primitive semblances of political parties began to emerge. The two-party system has existed in the United States since that time period. Ironically, a lot of people had early suspicions about the legitimacy of political parties, but they inevitably began to form as the Federalists formed behind Hamilton and the Democratic Republicans formed behind Thomas Jefferson. So the party out of power, the loyal opposition, traditionally plays an invaluable role in the balance wheel in the machinery of government. And the two-party system in America has existed since the split between Jefferson and Hamilton. We'll talk more about how these political parties functioned and debated their political ideas in class.